Well, as we announced last week, we're going to be taking some time this week to give a bit of a review of the year 2018. It's been certainly an eventful year. And so our staff at Korea 24 have selected 10 news stories. And we've also chosen Person of the Year, kind of similar to what you see with Time magazine and other publications and media outlets. So we're going to be covering the top 10 issues next Monday. But today we are going to be announcing the Person of the Year. Now, you might think it could be a politician or some kind of activist, a prominent figure. This year, though, we have decided, this being a global broadcast and this issue being pertinent not just here in Korea, but all over the world, namely the plight of refugees, that this year's Person of the Year for KBS World Korea 24 is the Yemeni refugees in Jeju. So for today's special interview, we're very pleased to have joining us an award-winning human rights filmmaker who is working on a series of films about the refugee issue here in Jeju. Very pleased to have Neil George here in the studio. Sir, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, as I briefly alluded to, you're making a film depicting the plight of the Yemeni refugees on Jeju Island. You've done other work here, and we'll talk about that briefly later. But this particular topic, what was sort of the decision-making process to focus on that?
Sure. I mean, I work quite closely with a Korean producer friend of mine, Kim Han-gil, and he was very interested in what happened when the Yemeni refugees started to kind of slowly come in. And after researching into the topic, he just kind of asked me if I wanted to make a film about this to try and find out a little bit more. The news media at the time, maybe you'll remember, was kind of not exactly giving a lot of information regarding the refugees. So we really wanted to listen to their stories and try and understand their kind of side of everything that was coming out of the media. So that was basically why we initially started to make the films.
And we understand that it is the production is a partnership with the UNHCR.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit how the production is going?
Sure, yeah. Basically, we spent about 3 or 4 days initially on Jeju just to talk with some of the refugees, just to listen to their stories and figure out the best way to approach the subject. And after doing that, we kind of went back and did some more research. And I approached the UNHCR to see if they might be interested in collaborating on the project. They took their time in responding, but eventually they came back and said they'd love to help out. Mm-hmm. And they effectively just gave us a little bit of sponsorship money to help with going to Jeju, as obviously it's quite a lot of time and money spent on production. And so we slowly kind of went back and forth a few times to Jeju now, we want to listen to the stories. I think that's the most important thing, and that's something that we weren't seeing in the media, is we weren't really hearing the voices of these refugees.
The film itself with the UNHCR, is it a short?
Yeah, it's a series of short films, so there will be around 4 to 5 short films that are produced. They're going to be on, I kind of picked the idea of words and depicting words that we all know, things like hope, passion, family. These are words that everybody knows, right. But for them, they have a very different meaning. So I wanted to try and tell their stories through these words and through their voices.
And aside from that, I understand you're also working on another separate project portraying with the refugees a more feature-length
Right, yeah. So next year we're going to start the production of the feature documentary. So that'll look into the bigger picture. Obviously, the short films are very much more human story orientated, and the documentary is going to look at the bigger picture, including looking at Korean history with the refugee situation, not just Yemen as well. We're going to touch on places like Syria, Sudan, Somalia, and obviously looking at the Middle East and the connection between Korea and the Middle East. So it'll be a broader
look really at the
situation. More of a broader and more informative as well. You know, I think a lot of people don't really understand the relationship between Yemen and Korea. So I think that's an important thing that Korean people can get from this film.
Right. And you've mentioned that a couple times already during this interview. This sort of, we can say, misunderstanding among the public, or perhaps the way the media has portrayed it. We were covering this issue as well, and it did feel like here the Korean media kind of pitted it more on sort of this framework of this is supposedly something that a lot of people are scared of. They're fearful.
Yeah.
Of course, all the erroneous reports of this idea of spreading Islamophobia and Sharia law around Korea. And you knew very well that there were those misperceptions heading into this, even though you said your Korean producer friend had asked you to take part in this project. Were there difficulties? Because I imagine there has been a lot of resistance, and this has been it's almost bizarre that there's almost a bipartisan from the extreme right and the extreme left, where there's this immense fear and you can say resentment or even outright hostility towards the refugees.
Yeah, very much. I mean, we filmed on the streets looking at the pro and the anti-refugee activists, and it was kind of disappointing, to be honest. You know, I spent a lot of time filming for the candlelight protests back in 2016 and seeing the solidarity that happened around that. And it almost seems like a kind of reversal in state. People not looking at the information, not looking at the facts, not looking at the history, just deciding really on just an opinion that they decided we don't like Muslims, we don't like Islam. We're just going to only focus on that kind of element of it rather than trying to understand, you know, what is actually happening with Yemen and the civil war that's been going on for a long time, not even the recent civil war, but the history of Yemen. And so it was kind of, for me, it was extremely disappointing to see the Korean people considering their history going back, you know, the war, the split, the divide, North, South Korea. And Yemen is basically going through a very similar kind of thing. So I kind of expected a lot more empathy, and I just didn't see it. So, you know, that's one of the reasons why we kind of were like, we need to, you know, look into this a lot more. We want people to really see. Yeah. Actually, there is a huge similarity going on between Yemen and Korea. And it's important that people try and look at that as much as the fact that it's a humanitarian crisis and people are going through the suffering of war.
And it is, I suppose, easy to describe the issue as a humanitarian crisis and how most of these refugees, for the most part, they did not choose to come to Jeju to settle here or to ask for asylum.
Very much.
And your expression of somewhat dismay or surprise or disappointment that there wasn't more empathy involved in terms of the average Joe on the street. Is that something that you feel is a uniquely Korean phenomenon, or because we've seen pockets as where you're from in Europe as well, where there does seem to be this growing fear, concern, worry, tinged with maybe economic anxiety as well as fear of the other that seems to be permeating all around the world?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of many things. It's not just, obviously, like you said, it's not just in Korea. We have in France, in America, particularly in America, in Europe as well. So I think the problem is that probably one of the main issues is people don't really understand where it's come from. Like they just put it as it's Muslim, it's Islam. But they don't see like the history of the Middle East. Right. And they don't see the influence that America, France, even my own country, United Kingdom, has had in the Middle East. Right. And you could say that they have a big influence of the outcomes of where we're at the moment. So it's a lot more than just a simple case of they're Islamic. I don't think it's not that simple question. It's a big it's a big conversation to be had.
And really just stuck in the middle of all of this are these refugees who are essentially in limbo.
Exactly,
the Korean government did recently make a decision, and they were facing a lot of pressure, these mass protests on the street, and they were mindful of that, certainly when they had that very restrictive policy. You spoke with these refugees. How do they feel? Because, you can have a German example of how they deal with refugees, and then you can have the other extreme, where it could be a country like the U.S. or some other European countries, or even Korea. And do you get a sense of them also feeling disappointment or dismay? Or
Yeah, I think they initially, when some of the first results came out, the families were given the initial humanitarian visas. They were a little surprised, at just that. So they were very optimistic that they're going to get refugee status. And when you listen to some of their stories, some of them are like police officers, there's journalists in there. I don't see how you can distinguish one particular job, so to say, as being persecuted against. All of them go back, if they were to go back somehow to Yemen, obviously not possible, but if they were to go back, there's an incredibly high possibility they're going to be persecuted.
Right.
So for me, it was difficult to kind of fathom why the Korean government only gave them the humanitarian status when clearly quite a lot of them should be qualified as refugees.
When can we see sort of the first fruits of your labor as far as the listening public goes?
Yeah, sure. I mean, hopefully we're going to be releasing at the beginning of next year, so around January, end of January time. I would like to release them as a series because
so we can binge it.
Yeah, then you can. It's a bit more impactful to be as a series, but that will depend on like production times. Okay. So hopefully beginning of next year. Yeah.
And just to round things out, because I briefly mentioned this in the beginning, but you are actually a long-established documentary filmmaker. You're based here in Korea. You've done other works that have really caught public attention, including the Seoul Ferry tragedy. You mentioned the candlelight protest, which resulted in a change of government. And you do... It seems tend to focus on a lot of issues dealing with human rights, particularly as it pertains here in Korea. Is that something that is going to be part of your focus and passion going forward here in Korea? Is that where you foresee kind of your energies to be directed at?
Yeah, I mean, when I first came here, I knew a fair amount about the country, and it was quite an interesting time in 2011, 2012. Like Park Geun-hye was just coming into power around that sort of time, and the country was definitely changing. And after initially meeting some of the North Korean refugees when I was working on a film with them, that made me even more interested in social issues. I'd already started in England. I'd done a lot of social issue content, so it was just a natural progression. And then obviously the Seoul film as well was a fascinating thing to see, and the transformation of the country that happened around sort of end of 2016 with, Park Geun-hye being impeached. And so, like, this country for me is really interesting. There's a lot of things still going on. There's still a lot of, issues that are happening with the elderly, with the young, with suicide, with, it's kind of never ending in terms of topics. So I wasn't actually expecting to be making a film about Yemen refugees in South Korea. So for the fact that I was able to, feel very privileged to be able to speak with them and talk with them and understand their stories. And hopefully in the future there'll be more. Yeah.
Well, the hope for me, and I think many of our listeners would maybe agree, is that you find it more and more difficult to find source material here to be able to make these documentaries. But something tells me that there will be other issues for you to certainly delve into and sink your teeth into. It's going to be a fascinating project. I hope a lot of people get to check it out. Neil, George, thank you so much for joining us, and really appreciate your time, and happy holidays to you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.